The dinner rush came to an abrupt halt when a young waitress quietly carried a warm plate of food to a homeless father sitting alone near the restaurant's entrance. He hadn't begged. He hadn't asked for money. He had only been trying to calm his hungry little daughter with a promise that broke every heart within earshot. "Just a few more minutes. Sweetheart," he whispered. "Maybe we'll find somewhere that still has free bread." The waitress couldn't ignore them. She paid for the meal with her own money and gently placed it on their table. The little girl smiled for the first time that day. But before they could take a single bite, the restaurant manager stormed across the dining room. "You've just given away company food without permission," he shouted. Every customer turned to watch. Then he pointed toward the door. "You're fired." The waitress lowered her head, believing she had just lost the job she desperately needed to support her younger brother. What happened next would leave an entire restaurant speechless. But before we continue, if stories about kindness, hope, and the incredible impact of ordinary people inspire you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Kindness Corner Stories, and share it with someone who believes compassion still matters. We'd also love to hear from you. Leave a comment telling us which city and country you're watching from. Your messages remind us that kindness connects people all around the world. Now, let's begin. Emily Harper was 24 years old, and she had learned long ago that life rarely gave second chances. 3 years earlier, she had lost both of her parents in a highway accident. Since then, she had become the legal guardian of her 16-year-old brother, Noah. Every morning before sunrise, she prepared his breakfast, reminded him to focus on school, and promised him that one day things would get better. Her job at Maple Street Grill wasn't glamorous, but it paid the rent on their tiny apartment and kept Noah's dream of attending college alive. Emily never complained. She believed every customer deserved the same warm smile, whether they ordered an expensive steak or a simple cup of coffee. That rainy Tuesday afternoon, business was unusually slow. Outside, dark clouds covered the sky as people hurried past the restaurant with umbrellas held tightly above their heads. While clearing a nearby table, Emily noticed a man standing across the street with a little girl no older than 7. His coat was soaked from the rain. His shoes were worn almost completely through. The little girl hugged a faded stuffed rabbit against her chest as she looked through the restaurant window at families enjoying hot meals. Emily watched the father kneel beside her. He brushed the wet hair away from her face and smiled, even though his own eyes were filled with exhaustion. "It's okay, Lily," he said softly. "We'll figure something out." The words were gentle, but behind them was the quiet pain of a father who had reached the end of every option. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. All she knew was that no child should have to look at a warm meal through a window while pretending not to be hungry. Without realizing it, she had just taken the first step toward a decision that would change not only her own life, but everyone else's inside Maple Street Grill. Emily stood silently for a few moments, watching the father and his daughter through the rain-streaked window. Every lesson her parents had ever taught her echoed in her mind. If you have enough to share, you already have enough. She glanced toward the kitchen, then at the nearly empty dining room. The lunch rush was over, and a fresh batch of chicken soup had just been prepared. Taking a slow breath, Emily reached into her apron, pulled out her wallet, and counted the small bills she had set aside for groceries. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She walked to the register. "I'd like to pay for 1 bowl of soup, a grilled cheese sandwich, 2 hot chocolates, and a slice of apple pie," she told the cashier. The cashier smiled. "For table number?" Emily looked toward the window, the father and his little girl outside. A few minutes later, she carried the tray to the empty patio where the man was helping his daughter stay dry beneath the restaurant's awning. "Excuse me?" Emily said gently. The father immediately stood. "I'm sorry. Ma'am, we weren't bothering anyone. We were just waiting for the rain to slow down." Emily smiled kindly. "I know." She placed the tray on the table. "This meal has already been paid for." The little girl stared at the steaming soup with wide eyes. "Daddy," the father looked confused. "There must be a mistake." "There isn't. I can't afford this." "You don't have to." His eyes filled with tears. "I don't even know your name." "I'm Emily." He hesitated before extending a rough, trembling hand. "I'm David." Before he could say another word, little Lily whispered something that nearly broke Emily's heart. "Is this really for us?" Emily knelt beside her. "It really is." Lily smiled so brightly that, for a brief moment, the hardships of the past seemed to disappear. "Can I have some after Daddy eats first?" David looked away, embarrassed. Emily realized the child wasn't worried about herself. She was worried her father was even hungrier than she was. "There's enough for both of you," Emily said softly. As David thanked her again, she quietly returned inside, hoping no one had noticed. But someone had. Restaurant manager Kevin Brooks had watched everything from the office window. His face was hard with disapproval. He marched into the dining room, his voice echoing across the restaurant. "Emily!" Every customer turned toward them. "Did you just serve people who weren't paying customers?" Emily remained calm. "I paid for their meal myself." Kevin folded his arms. "That doesn't matter." "It absolutely does," Emily replied respectfully. "The food wasn't free. I bought it." Kevin shook his head. "You invited homeless people onto restaurant property. Do you know what message that sends to our guests?" Several customers looked uncomfortable. One elderly woman quietly whispered to her husband, "The message I saw was kindness." Kevin ignored her. "This restaurant has standards," Emily answered gently. "So does compassion." Kevin's expression darkened. "You don't make the rules here." He pulled her name. "Tag from her apron. Turn in your apron." The dining room fell completely. "Silent, you're fired." Emily's heart sank. She thought of Noah, the rent due next week, his school fees, the groceries. They still needed. For a brief second, she wondered if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. Outside, David had heard every word through the open doorway. He slowly stood up. Leaving his untouched bowl of soup on the table, Lily tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy." David looked at her with a gentle smile. "Stay right here, sweetheart." Then, despite his worn clothes and tired appearance, he walked calmly toward the restaurant entrance. Not to argue, not to beg, but to say something that no one inside was expecting to hear. And before anyone could stop him, the front door opened once again. At that exact moment, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot. A distinguished older man stepped out, looked through the restaurant window, and the moment his eyes landed on David, his expression changed completely. Without a second's hesitation, he hurried toward the entrance, smiling as though he had just found someone he'd been searching for over many years. The restaurant grew unusually quiet as the older man stepped inside. Rainwater dripped from his coat, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes remained fixed on David. The manager immediately recognized him. "Mr. Bennett!" Kevin exclaimed, straightening his tie. "Welcome!" "We weren't expecting you today." Every employee knew who he was. Richard Bennett, the founder and owner of Maple Street Grill, rarely visited his restaurants without notice. He had built a small neighborhood diner into one of the most respected family restaurant chains in the state. Kevin forced a confident smile. "Everything is under control, sir. We just had a minor issue with an employee." Richard barely acknowledged him. Instead, he walked directly toward David. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then a warm smile spread across Richard's face. He extended both hands. "David." David looked surprised. "It's been a long time." "Richard." The owner shook his hand firmly. "Far too long." Kevin blinked in confusion. "You know each other?" Richard turned toward him. "Know each other?" He smiled. "I wouldn't be standing here today if it weren't for him." The dining room fell silent. Customers stopped eating. The kitchen staff gathered near the service window. Even Emily, still holding her folded apron, looked up in disbelief. Richard placed a hand on David's shoulder. "Everyone sees a homeless man. I see the person who once gave me a future." The room was frozen. Kevin's confident expression slowly disappeared. Richard looked around the restaurant before speaking again. 20 years ago, I owned exactly one tiny diner. It was failing. I was weeks away from closing forever. My wife was ill. Our son was only 5 years old. I couldn't pay my employees. I honestly believed my dream was over. David lowered his eyes. "You don't have to tell them." "Yes," Richard replied gently. "I do," he continued. "One snowy evening, a delivery truck skidded across an icy road and crashed into my restaurant. The building was badly damaged. My insurance claim was delayed. I had no money left." Richard smiled as he looked at David, "And that's when this man walked through my front door." David laughed quietly. "I was just delivering construction supplies." "You were delivering hope," Richard corrected. "He spent the entire night helping us secure the building. He brought his own tools. He called friends to volunteer. He refused to charge us a single dollar." Emily listened carefully. Richard continued. "The next morning, when I tried to pay him, he smiled and said something I'll never forget." Richard looked at David. "One day, when life gives you the chance, feed someone who's hungry. That's payment enough." Emily's eyes widened. David had never expected those simple words to be remembered. Richard's voice grew emotional. "I built this business on that promise. Every Maple Street Grill has a policy. If someone is truly hungry and genuinely in need, we feed them." Gasps spread across the dining room. Kevin looked stunned. I've never heard of that policy." Richard's expression became serious. "Because somewhere along the way, people stopped reading the values we built this company on." He slowly turned toward Emily. "I watched everything on the security cameras before I came inside. You didn't steal. You didn't break company rules. You lived by them." Emily could barely speak. "I was just trying to help." Richard smiled warmly. "And that's exactly why people like you belong here." Then he looked back at David. "There's one more thing everyone deserves to know." David frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Richard's smile grew wider. "For years, every major decision I've made has carried two names. My own," he paused, "and my partner's." David looked genuinely confused. "Partner?" Richard nodded. "I've never forgotten whose kindness saved my first restaurant." He reached into his briefcase and carefully removed an old, faded photograph. It showed two younger men standing outside a damaged little diner. One was Richard, the other was David. On the back, written in fading blue ink, were the words, "Dreams survive when good people refuse to walk away." Richard held up the photograph for everyone to see. Then, with unmistakable pride, he looked at David and said, "Welcome back." "Partner!" The restaurant fell completely silent. Some customers wiped tears from their eyes. Emily smiled through hers. But the greatest surprise of all, it was still waiting to unfold. For several long seconds, no one in the restaurant spoke. The only sound was the gentle rain tapping against the windows. David stared at the old photograph in Richard's hands. A flood of memories came rushing back. The freezing winter night, the damaged diner, the exhausted young owner who refused to give up, and the promise he had never expected anyone to remember. He smiled softly. I only helped because it was the right thing to do. Richard shook his head. And that's exactly why I never forgot. Turning toward everyone in the dining room, Richard raised the faded photograph. People think businesses are built by money, he said. They're not. They're built by trust, compassion, and ordinary people who choose to do the right thing when no one is watching. Every employee listened in. Silence. Richard then faced Kevin. I've spent 30 years teaching one principle. He pointed to the restaurant's framed mission statement, hanging near the entrance. Serve every guest with dignity. His voice grew firmer. Dignity doesn't disappear because someone loses a home. Kevin lowered his head. I failed to live by that. Richard nodded. You judged a man by his appearance instead of his character. Then he looked at Emily, and you reminded this restaurant who we are. Emily's eyes filled with tears. I thought I had lost my job. Richard smiled warmly. Not today. He took the folded apron from her hands and placed it back in her arms. I'd like you to keep wearing it. The customers erupted into applause. Richard wasn't finished. Effective. Immediately, he announced. Emily Harper is promoted to Community Outreach Coordinator for every Maple Street grill in this region. In addition to serving guests, she'll help lead our neighborhood meal program so no child leaves our doors hungry. Emily covered her mouth in disbelief. Mr. Bennett, I don't know what to say. Just keep being yourself. The applause grew even louder. Kevin stepped toward David. I'm deeply sorry, he said sincerely. I saw worn clothes and assumed the worst. I forgot that every person has a story. David smiled kindly. The best apology is treating the next person better. Kevin nodded. I will. Richard then turned to David once more. Now, partner, let me ask you something. David laughed. I have a feeling you're about to surprise me again. Richard reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. I've recently launched a non-profit foundation that helps families move from emergency shelters into permanent housing. We renovate abandoned homes and provide job training. He handed the folder to David. I need someone who understands construction and someone whose heart has always been bigger than his circumstances. David looked confused. You want me? I don't want an employee. Richard smiled. I want my partner. David's hands trembled as he opened the folder. Inside was an offer to become Director of Community Housing. Projects. A steady salary. Health insurance. Educational. Support for Lily. And a handwritten note that simply read, Thank you for keeping your promise. It's my turn to keep mine. Tears rolled down David's face. Lily hugged her father tightly. Daddy? Yes, sweetheart? Does this mean we're going to have a home again? Unable to speak, David simply nodded. The little girl burst into happy tears. Emily wiped her own eyes as she watched them embrace. In that moment, she realized something beautiful. The meal she had paid for wasn't what changed David's life. It simply reminded the right people of the man he had always been. A few months later, Maple Street Grill launched the Neighbor's Table program, allowing customers to prepay meals for families in need. Thousands of meals were shared across the city, inspiring other local restaurants to create similar programs. Emily continued greeting every guest with the same genuine smile. David helped dozens of struggling families rebuild their lives. Through the Housing Foundation, and every Saturday morning, Richard, David, Emily, Lily, and Noah volunteered together, serving breakfast to anyone who needed it, because kindness, when passed from one heart to another, never truly ends. Before we say goodbye, thank you for being part of Kindness Corner Stories. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, like, and share it with someone who believes compassion can change lives. And if you haven't already, tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from. We love seeing our kindness family grow around the world. Always remember, a meal may satisfy someone's hunger for a day, but a single act of kindness, offered with no expectation of reward, can nourish hope for a lifetime. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.